I have acknowledged I have made my own mistakes, and I have owned up to them publicly and under oath. But silence and complicity in the face of the daily destruction of our basic norms and civility to one another will not be one of them. I did things and I acted improperly, at times at Mr. Trump's behest. I blindly followed his demands. My loyalty to Mr. Trump has cost me everything. My family's happiness, friendships, my law license, my company, my livelihood, my honor, my reputation, and soon my freedom. And I will not sit back, say nothing, and allow him to do the same to the country. Indeed, given my experience working for Mr. Trump, I fear that if he loses the election in 2020, that there will never be a peaceful transition of power. And this is why I agreed to appear before you today. In closing, I'd like to say directly to the President, we honor our veterans even in the rain. You tell the truth even when it doesn't aggrandize you. You respect the law and our incredible law enforcement agents. You don't villainize them. You don't disparage generals, Gold Star families, prisoners of war, and other heroes who had the courage to fight for this country. You don't attack the media and those who question what you don't like or what you don't want them to say. And you take responsibility for your own dirty deeds. You don't use your power of your bully pulpit to destroy the credibility of those who speak out against you. You don't separate families from one another or demonize those looking to America for a better life. You don't vilify people based on the God they pray to, and you don't cuddle up to our adversaries at the expense of our allies. And finally, you don't shut down the government before Christmas and New Year's just to simply appease your base. This behavior is churlish, it denigrates the office of the president, and it's simply un-American. And it's not you. So to those who support the president and his rhetoric, as I once did, I pray the country doesn't make the same mistakes that I have made or pay the heavy price that my family and I are paying. And I thank you very much for this additional time, Chairman.
Welcome to the Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore. It is Friday, June the 5th, 2020. The voice you heard before mine was Michael Cohen, testifying last year, February 27th, 2019, before Congress, specifically the House Oversight Committee. That was his closing statement to the committee that you just heard. Cohen, who of course spent time in prison for his involvement in Donald Trump's criminality, has since been released due to the coronavirus from what was approximately a 3-year term behind bars. He was released somewhere in the last month or two due to coronavirus and is currently under a house arrest. Cohen in that clip was warning all of us about Donald Trump, was telling us about what Donald Trump is doing. And since he issued that warning, we have seen exactly what Michael Cohen is talking about. We have seen it this week very clearly. But in the intervening year and prior to when Michael Cohen made that statement, on this edition of The Politicrat, I will take a look at a number of events, not only this week, but also from the past 3 years of this quote-unquote presidency. And what Donald Trump is doing and how dangerous he has become. And, very seriously, a look at what Michael Cohen said. The possibility that Donald Trump will not go quietly or peacefully, and that there may indeed be violence on the part of some of his followers. This is not to scare people, but this episode is to really open people's eyes and wake them up to be aware of the possibility of these things. That and a few other observations when I return. Welcome back. This episode will feature lengthy audio segments, and I think they speak for themselves. Donald Trump is a grave danger to the United States of America. I think that many people in this country are waking up to that reality. Many people who are currently in the streets all over this country in the name of George Floyd, in the name of seeking justice for him and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and many, many other black people murdered by police in the name of seeking and trying to make a brand new system that gives better policing, returns us to a time where community-based policing was in effect to some degrees in this country, in some neighborhoods, mainly white neighborhoods. America is waking up. The question is, will they be able to vote this November? Joe Biden actually, a month or two ago, had wondered out loud, saying that he thought that Donald Trump might seek to postpone the election. The Trump campaign swatted that away as a conspiracy theory, but is it? Based on what we've seen, based on what you heard from Michael Cohen, who of course was Donald Trump's lawyer for 10 years, Donald Trump's thug, Donald Trump's henchman, or as some in the media described it, his fixer, said that Donald Trump will not go quietly or peacefully. What he didn't mention was the word violently. And I think that Donald Trump, if he loses this November, as I think he will make the following 2 months, that from November of this year to January of 2021, an absolute living hell for all of us in the United States. That is not alarmism. That is a realism. And it is based upon what we've seen in these previous 3.5 years. It is based upon how he's behaved for decades prior. We've seen some things this week in this country that certainly would not sit well with the founding fathers, as they are called, of this country. And what you are about to hear, and I'll be playing it in sections, is a segment from MSNBC's Morning Joe from June the 4th, 2020. It is a really good bit of television. The only problem with it is that it was played early in the morning on the West Coast of the United States, and at a time on the East Coast where people who are able to go back to work were on their way to work or at work. And so a vast majority of those people probably did not get to watch this at all. And it's a shame that this audio that I'm going to be playing you over the next few minutes was not played in prime time. I think that would have been a great thing for this country. At least in this episode of The Politicrat, I will be playing this, I think, quite frankly, very important piece of audio in segments. You will hear first the voice of Willie Geist. You will also hear the voice of Joe Scarborough. Joe Scarborough recently attacked by Donald Trump with lies. Donald Trump knows perfectly well that Joe Scarborough is no fan of his, at least not anymore. And his show now has gone full bore in exposing Donald Trump for who he is. Someone without morals, someone without laws, someone without any rationality, and someone without empathy. Here is just the first portion of what was, I think, quite frankly, an incredible segment on Morning Joe, which I'm, by the way, not a big fan of at all. Here's Willie Geist. Listen very carefully to what is being said here.
Following President Trump's threat to use active duty troops to combat protests and his administration's violent clearing of a peaceful protest for a photo op, the Washington Post reported that a number of CIA veterans who monitored crackdowns abroad see troubling parallels in President Trump's handling of the protests. The report reads this way: the scenes have been disturbingly familiar to CIA analysts accustomed to monitoring scenes of societal unraveling abroad. The massing of protesters, the ensuing crackdowns, and the awkwardly staged displays of strength by a leader determined to project authority. In interviews and posts on social media in recent days, current and former U.S. intelligence officials have expressed dismay at the similarity between events at home and the signs of decline or democratic regression they were trained to detect in other nations. One of those former CIA analysts is Gail Helt. She was responsible for tracking developments in China and Southeast Asia and told the Post she has seen this kind of violence before, saying, quote, "This is what autocrats do. This is what happens in countries before a collapse. It really does unnerve me." And Gail joins us now. She is now a professor at King University in Tennessee. Also with us this morning, author of the book entitled Surviving Autocracy, staff writer at The New Yorker, Masha Gessen, and author and staff writer at The Atlantic, Anne Applebaum. Her recent piece for the magazine is entitled History Will Judge the Complicit, in which she argues that Republican leaders abandon their principles in support of a, quote, immoral and dangerous president. Gail, let me begin with you and your quote to the Washington Post about the parallels you see in the United States today and what you've seen abroad over many years. What specifically concerns you here?
Well, I think it culminated for me a little bit after I made those comments, actually. But when I saw President Trump walk to the front of that church after he violently cleared protesters, standing there holding up a Bible, it just reminded me of every image I've seen, for example, of Kim Jong-un standing on the top of Mount Haktu or sitting on that white horse. And the imagery that it conjured, when Kim Jong-un does that, it's to conjure a divine image. And that's what it seemed like Donald Trump Trump was doing. And that really, really unnerved me. And that comes on at the end of 3 years of him eroding our trust in our democratic institutions, eroding the institutions themselves. We don't believe our press anymore. We don't believe in our intelligence community anymore. We don't respect our civil servants anymore. Donald Trump doesn't respect the Constitution anymore. And all of those things coming together, honestly, I'm terrified.
Anne Applebaum, we've been talking about your extraordinary piece in The Atlantic for some time, and it seems to underline the fact that our founders, they anticipated an out-of-control chief executive. They anticipated an out-of-control president. In fact, they put in Madisonian safeguards to make sure that there were checks and balances to check would-be tyrants. What they never imagined in their darkest dreams, their worst scenarios, would be a compliant Congress. That's what you were actually talking about yesterday on Twitter, and also what your piece delved into. How concerned should we be?
Well, I think very concerned. And, the issue is not just the compliant Congress. It's also compliant top officials. We are used to the idea that certain institutions in a liberal democracy are nonpartisan. The State Department, the Army, the CIA, these are institutions that serve whoever is in power, no matter, what he or she does, whichever political party they serve to. Since he has taken over the White House, Trump has sought to change the nature of these institutions and make them answerable to him alone. That's what we saw in Lafayette Square when he tried to use the Army and to evoke, use Army leaders beside him to evoke the idea that somehow the Army was on his side, that it was a partisan institution. That's what we see when he downgrades, when he insults the CIA, when he insults the FBI. And the fact that leaders of those institutions and, as you say, leaders of Congress have not fought back, have not stood out, have not tried to object to any of this. This is an important sign of democratic decline. These are people who are no longer willing, because of a variety of reasons that I described in the article, no longer willing to stand up for institutions that they know are being damaged and for values that they know are right.
Anne, could you have ever imagined, and this is not a leading question, I'm just curious, because I didn't ever imagine, and I guess it's just a great lack of imagination on my part, but did you ever imagine an American president in this time first attacking the press as enemies of the people like Stalin did, then attacking an independent federal judiciary, questioning the legitimacy of federal judges when they ruled against his travel bans, his Muslim bans, and then attacking our intelligence agencies, vicious attacks against the CIA, the FBI, and the Republican Party standing quietly by as he did it, acquiescing.
Yes, look, there are reasons why he's attacking those kinds of institutions, because those are the institutions that are capable of holding him to account. The free press can investigate whether or not his companies are making money off his presidency. The judiciary can turn down or counter things that he says or laws that he passes. And his attempt to limit those institutions is in a way of trying to expand his power. Everybody who's in Congress right now knows that. This is not a question of, people in the world who might vote for Trump because they don't pay much attention to politics and the economy was doing great before and so on. No, these are people who understand the Constitution extremely well. They know that Trump has overstepped the bounds. Many of them say so off the record. Many of them say so to their Democratic colleagues in Congress. Nevertheless, they have been unwilling, a combination of desire to be close to power, fear of losing power themselves, desire to conform, fear of being embarrassed or attacked on Twitter, and sometimes using even a kind of Vichyite argument, which is that the other side is worse. In other words, we have to collaborate with Donald Trump no matter what he does, because the left is so dangerous and so negative and so damaging to American life that we have to prevent it. This is the kind of argument that has been used in occupied countries in the past. This is how, when France was occupied by the Nazis, this is how Vichy, these were the Nazi collaborators in France, this is how they justified what they did. We have to collaborate with Germany because the alternative is so much worse.
I mean, this is just extraordinary stuff that Morning Joe on June 4th, 2020 discussed. I think that this should continue to be discussed. I mean, this is exactly the kind of thing that the corporate news media should continue to talk about. The only thing, again, I lament about this is that it was not discussed during prime time. It was done at a time in the morning where most people were at work and therefore missed this conversation, completely missed it. I want to, before I go further, because there is still more of this conversation that took place on that program, Morning Joe, I want to just read something from a book written by Anonymous. It's called A Warning. That's the title of the book. By Anonymous, a senior Trump administration official. As far as I know, well, I guess I wouldn't really know this if they are anonymous. But at least at the time of the book's writing in 2019, and the time that it was released in that year, the senior Trump administration official was still in the administration. I don't know if he or she or they are still in the administration as of this date of June the 5th, 2020. I don't know. But it is worth looking at a line, or at least reading a line from this book. It's actually from the introduction of the book. And what Anonymous says is that after the publishing of the op-ed in the New York Times from Anonymous, and this was in 2018, if you remember that New York Times op-ed that caused such a stir, and Trump was asking, who did it? Who did it? Is they're going to be investigated? You know, Sarah Sanders, when she was the press secretary, they're going to be investigated. They're disgruntled. And everybody denied that they had done this. Many of the people who denied that they wrote this anonymous op-ed in the New York Times have actually left the administration. Here is what Anonymous writes. After I published the op-ed in the Times, Trump responded with a one-word tweet. Treason? Those 7 letters say it all. To the president, criticism is treasonous. I find this to be a very un-American position. Former President Theodore Roosevelt argued that it was treacherous not to criticize the nation's chief executive, as long as it was honest criticism. Quote, to announce that there must be no criticism of the president, or that we are to stand by the president, right or wrong, is not only unpatriotic and servile, but is morally treasonable to the American public, he wrote. Quote, nothing but the truth should be spoken about him or anyone else. But it is even more important to tell the truth, pleasant or unpleasant, about him than about anyone else, end quote. We do not owe the president our silence. We owe him the truth. That from the book A Warning by Anonymous, a senior Trump administration official. We should continue to criticize Donald Trump or any other person in government, no matter what their party. We should continue to criticize the Republican Party specifically for their silence. Where are they on the brutal police tactics, the violence that police have levied all week long against peaceful protesters? There are videos all over social media showing you police violating people's rights, violating their personal space. There have been videos with police groping women and beating them. Women who aren't doing anything. No one is posing a threat to these police. We've had police shoot people. We've had police shoot journalists. We've had police blind journalists in their eye. We've had unprovoked violence all over the place by police. And yet some of the media, by the way, are not even talking about it. They're only covering some instances of violence against police, and they are abhorrent, of course, and I condemn them. What the media are not doing, on the other hand, is covering the vast amounts of police violence against people just minding their own business who are just protesting and exercising their First Amendment rights. There are so many videos on Twitter, on any other platform you can see. I've posted just a few of them at my Twitter handle. You can see all of these videos. And they are all over the place. Police pepper spraying people in their faces and their eyes, macing them, macing 9-year-old girls. Posing in photos on Instagram with a caption that says, "Let's start a riot." That, by the way, that cop from Denver, a Denver Police Department officer, was shown the door, sacked, fired earlier this week. What happened this week and what happened last week were police riots. The media will have you believe otherwise. These were police riots all over this country. Driving their SUVs into protesters, as the NYPD did in New York. And you have a mayor and a governor not coming out strongly against this. If anything, Governor Cuomo in New York said that the NYPD hadn't had a strong enough handle on the situation. He actually criticized the NYPD this week for not getting looting under control. And he actually made an apology to the NYPD. I didn't hear any comments from him about the NYPD SUVs that was slamming into protesters. A lot of this violence was provoked by police, by the way. A lot of this violence was done by police. Videos online, I've talked about this before, of police smashing in businesses, high-end businesses, smashing them with hammers, smashing the glass, breaking windows with hammers. Police doing this, uniformed police doing this. The police were absolutely rioting and then blaming it on protesters and then blaming it on the people who would come along and literally see that storefronts were open. We've seen this before in Chicago, where police would drive a truck up to a certain area, typically in black neighborhoods, and would leave the back of the truck open. A truck that had all kinds of Nike shoes and all kinds of things in the back of it, and left it in an impoverished neighborhood in Chicago where some poor black people lived. And some of the people, having seen that truck open at the back, would typically take the shoes. Once they took the shoes, it was a complete entrapment play. They would be immediately arrested by undercover police who would swoop in. Police entrap, police instigate. I'm not condoning stealing, but this country condones looting by the very rich, by corporations, by Donald Trump. Those are the facts. Welcome back. More of that, I think, extraordinary discussion on MSNBC's Morning Joe program that took place on June 4th, 2020. I'm playing this because I really do think it's very important to listen to, and as many people were at work, certainly on the East Coast, and people on the West Coast perhaps still sleeping, unless they turned on their DVRs. A lot of people, I think, may well have missed this very important conversation. Continuing on now, you're going to hear from Willie Geist, and you're going to hear from Masha Gessen.
Masha Gessen, you have been a consistent and courageous critic of Vladimir Putin and his regime in Russia, and it does take real courage, as we know, to be a consistent critic of Vladimir Putin. What do you see in the streets of America over the last 10 days as someone who has studied autocracy abroad?
What I am seeing is the performance of fascism. Donald Trump, I think, is showing us, and he has told us before, but it's never been quite as clear and quite as frightening. He's showing us what he thinks power looks like and sounds like. He thinks that power looks like unidentified troops on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial or guarding the White House. And this, I think, is particularly frightening. We're seeing this display of military force and a display of refusal to be accountable in any way. The fact that these troops are refusing to identify themselves, the fact that they're unmarked, is absolutely terrifying to me. He thinks that power looks like Black Hawk helicopters being used to clear protesters. He thinks it looks like tear gas being used to clear protesters. He thinks it sounds like the word dominate, which he repeated over and over again on his phone call with governors. And this is a performance of power, and it's a performance of fascism. Right? Everything that we know about fascism, it is power that is concentrated in the hands of one nation, one race, and it brutally suppresses dissent. We're seeing that now. He has chosen his role, whether he's capable of grasping the concept or not.
So, Masha, you've described this as a performance of fascism. What comes next in the practice of fascism, and do you see that headed in this direction?
I don't make predictions, but I can tell you what we are observing. What we're observing, a power grab always begins as a performance, right? A claim is made, and then the autocrat sees, or the aspiring autocrat sees, whether the claim is accepted, right? Whether the performance is believed. That's what we're asking right now, and I think that the signs are extremely worrisome. We have seen some voices from the military object to this claim to unitary power and to the right to use military force in the United States. But we have not seen an appropriate reaction from Congress. We have not seen an insurrection within the White House, which is what we should be seeing. We should be seeing this power claim being rejected.
So, Gail, we have seen some of the military pushing back. We've seen federal judges over the past several years, including judges described as conservatives, pushing back against Donald Trump's unconstitutional reaches of power. And we've seen quite a few bureaucrats, inspectors generals who ultimately got fired, doing the same thing. But I am wondering whether, as we look at what Donald Trump's done over the past 3.5 years, and whether we look forward to a time past Donald Trump in the White House, whether we need to figure out how to rely less on norms, less on constitutional norms, less on political norms, and actually instead put more laws on the book that actually constrains a president in a way that would have been helpful over the past 3.5 years, be that president Democratic or Republican.
I think that there is something to that. I do believe that putting more laws on the books would definitely be beneficial. Having something concrete to actually, throw up there when, God forbid, another president down the road takes an authoritarian turn. But I don't want to minimize the importance of these norms and especially American values. We used to have values that would have deterred a president from behaving in this way. We had a fairly tightly knit, even though it's flawed, societal fabric. And over the years, that's weakened a little bit, but Donald Trump has pretty much unraveled it. But that societal fabric basically are the American values that we hold dear. And those values place our Constitution pretty much above all else. And yet, over the last 3 years, Americans themselves don't really value the Constitution, because if they did, there would be public outcry over Trump's behavior. And I want to see us kind of rally around our founding values and documents more. And I'm hoping that the next administration will be able to facilitate that.
And you challenged General Mattis to speak out. Yesterday, you challenged Republican leaders to speak out, who should be speaking out given their backgrounds. Are you hopeful that that's going to happen? Are you hopeful that the institutions will hold for the next 6 months?
Well, as you know, General Mattis did speak out after the article was published. I can't take credit for that, obviously, but he and a number of other senior generals do seem to have been very alarmed, and I'm glad they're speaking, because those are voices that have a lot of influence on the side that matters, namely the side, the group of Americans who support the president. Let me answer your question in a slightly sideways way by responding partly to the one that you asked Masha Gessen, which is what would come next. And the answer is, in a lot of illiberalizing countries, or in countries that cease to be democracies, what comes next is the attempt to steal an election. And what I hope all Americans will be focused on over the next several months is, will Trump and will the Republican Party collaborate in an attempt to steal this election? Will they try to change the rules? Will they mess around with distance voting? Will they, exacerbate the problems caused by the pandemic to prevent people from voting? That's the thing that's going to happen next. And the real test for the Republican Party is, will they, do they value democracy in America enough to allow a real election to go through and to allow themselves to lose. And to that point, while I think there'll be a few people who will break out of it, I'm doubtful as to whether we can rely on the party leadership.
And the president's already working hard to discredit mail-in voting, to your point. Anne Applebaum at The Atlantic, Gail Helt, former CIA analyst, and Masha Gessen of The New Yorker. Masha is the author of the new book, Surviving Autocracy. Thank you all for this conversation. Good to have you with us. Coming up next on Morning Joe.
Really good conversation there. And you got to hear every word of it. I hope that it gave you some food for thought. It's certainly unsettling, but it really is a conversation that must be heard. And it must be a conversation that we have right now, because we are now 5 months away, just under 5 months away from the presidential election. And we don't know yet how that's going to look. We don't know if it's going to be all vote by mail. Of course, there are many states which are mailing out ballots to individuals all over who can vote. We know that there is the small issue of the Postal Service, the U.S. Postal Service, which is under attack from Donald Trump, and also, by the way, is having issues with funding and is in grave need of help. So we know that that is a variable. And if the U.S. Postal Service encounters difficulty, that means that by September it essentially does not have the capabilities to do what it does, then obviously vote by mail would be severely jeopardized. As Anne Applebaum articulated there toward the end, the question becomes, will Republicans stand up and fight back against Donald Trump? And I think that you know the answer to that question already. Remember, today is exactly 3 months to the very day that 52 Republican senators acquitted Donald Trump for abuse of power at the sham trial in the Senate. That was just 3 months ago today that acquittal took place. They acquitted him. 52 Republican senators acquitted Donald Trump. Many of those Republican senators went behind closed doors and admitted to their Democratic colleagues that Donald Trump was guilty of abuse of power, but yet that they knew that they were going to vote to acquit him anyway, because they admitted to people like Senator Sherrod Brown, the Democratic senator out of Ohio, that they were afraid of Donald Trump. Senator Sherrod Brown went so far as to write an op-ed in the New York Times detailing his Republican colleagues, whom I believe he may have quoted, if not mentioned their names, saying that they were afraid and they knew that Donald Trump had committed crimes. They knew that Donald Trump committed impeachable offenses. But nonetheless, don't worry, we're going to vote to acquit him. And that is exactly what they did. February 5th, 2020 could well turn out to be a huge turning point in the history of the United States of America.
This Jewish weekly in Germany published a front-page editorial saying that everyone should calm down. Now that the Nazis are in power, we don't believe that Herr Hitler and his friends will do all the things that they promised. They won't suddenly take away the constitutional rights of German Jews. They won't lock us up in race ghettos or unleash the murderous mobs on us. They can't do these things because the Constitution won't let them. Back in the U.S., the New York Times agreed. They reassured the American people that things would not be that bad. They even wrote flattering articles and said that Hitler's anti-Semitism was not so genuine or violent as it sounded, and he was merely using anti-Semitism as a bait to catch followers.
When you track how people first reacted to Hitler and Mussolini, they said, oh, he's just insane. Or the classic thing is that the elite party, in this case, the GOP, we're going to invite him into power, and then we're going to control him.
How am I doing? Am I doing okay? I'm president. Hey, I'm president. Did you believe it, right?
Over and over in history, what has happened is that these people get invited in, they get legitimized, and then they take over the show.
There is no Republican Party. There's a Trump Party.
At 12:05 p.m. on January 20th, 2017, just minutes after being sworn in as president,
So help me God.
Trump filed the paperwork for the Trump 2020 re-election campaign.
That audio was from Michael Moore's documentary Fahrenheit 11/9. The documentary was released in 2018. What Michael Moore does there is look at the past to inform us in the present. One thing that we here in America do not have a very strong grasp of, at least many of us, is history. Quite frankly, not just American history, but global history. That's down to lots of things, including a very poorly funded education system. We really don't teach civics anymore in this country. Textbooks have become highly partisan in the classroom. Episodes of enslavement and genocide and the periods of those two events have been whitewashed out of a lot of textbooks, or put in a light that made it seem more incidental than anything. So that clip was talking about how the Germans responded to the advent of Hitler, looking at him as some kind of buffoon. Of course, that is how some people have been looking at Donald Trump and still look at him even now. But I think that, again, as I said earlier, most Americans are, quite frankly, wide awake now. The photo op this week, the tear gassing of peaceful protesters in Washington, D.C., so that Donald Trump could just get a photo op in front of a church with a Bible. And he used the same pose that Hitler used, holding up a Bible literally with the Bible in the crook of his hand and his thumb under the Bible in the crook of his hand between his index finger and thumb. Hitler had the exact same pose in a photograph. You can't tell me that Donald Trump didn't look at that photograph. And he posed right in front of a church, holding the Bible in exactly the same way that Hitler did. This is obviously a signal to his base, but it's also a signal to the rest of us that this guy is the next Führer. This guy is a dictator. And one place I would differ from the conversation that you heard between Joe Scarborough and Willie Geist and Ann Applebaum and the CIA person that you heard from, I think I forgot her name. Her last name is Helt. I can't believe I've forgotten her. And Judy Helt, I guess. I don't remember. And also Masha Gessen, is that, well, in regards to Masha Gessen, is that I don't think this is just performance. Yes, it's obviously a performative thing that he did on Monday, that Trump did on Monday, but I think it goes further than that. I think this is him auditioning who he really is. And I'd probably even go further than that and say, no, this is him being a fascist. I have maintained for several years now that Donald Trump is indeed a fascist, is indeed an authoritarian. And I didn't have to wait until this week to realize it. And of course, none of the people that you heard in the clips that I played had any illusions about this either. They all knew, and certainly knew before this week, that Donald Trump either aspired to be or was a fascist and authoritarian. It's very clear. His best buddies are all fascist or authoritarian or dictatorship type people or autocrats, whether it is someone like President Duterte out in the Philippines, whether it is Vladimir Putin, whether it is President Xi in China, whether it is, of course, MBS in Saudi Arabia, whether it is Viktor Orban in Hungary or Erdogan in Turkey, who Donald Trump bowed to last year when what he did was extremely dangerous. People have already forgotten this. Donald Trump told U.S. troops to stand down. Now, can you imagine this? He told U.S. military personnel to stand down along the Turkey-Syria border and allow forces that were enemy to the United States to take the Kurds, or to rather take or let go, I should say, all the Al-Qaeda operatives who were being held by the Kurds, I should say. And then the Kurds were attacked and killed. This happened September/October of 2019. People have already forgotten that happened. So when you juxtapose that, releasing and telling American military personnel, armed personnel, to stand down, stop protecting this zone, allow your enemies to come in and let these Al-Qaeda operatives go. Versus this week, Donald Trump saying, send in the military. We're going to send the military into the streets of this country to terrorize Americans and teach them a lesson and dominate them. And you've got helicopters in the streets in this country intimidating Americans who are engaging in peaceful protest, who are engaging and using their First Amendment rights. What a contrast between that and the Turkish-Syria border. Stand down along the border in Turkey and Syria, but no, we're going to sic military on Americans. That is thoroughly abhorrent and repugnant, and certainly a violation of First Amendment rights at best. And then the church and state violations by Donald Trump. At least symbolically, he violated it. Holding up a Bible. You're a member of government and you're holding up a Bible in front of a church, and you're doing it for your base, for politics. Everything Donald Trump has done, apart from committing crimes and lying and playing golf and tweeting and sitting on his backside for the last 3.5 years, has been political, has been designed for re-election purposes. His bid for re-election, whether it was with trying to scuttle Joe Biden by making a phone call to the Ukraine president last year, almost a year ago now, that backfired. Donald Trump got impeached. Whether it was the whole notion of spreading this garbage about vote by mail is bad, when he votes by mail. whether it is the notion of, oh, well, there's illegal voters. He's been floating this lie for 3 or 4 years now. All to prime you and massage you mentally into thinking that he might have a point here. Somewhere in your mind, you may absolutely, having been bombarded for 3.5 years by these lies, by this gaslighting, by this propaganda from Donald Trump, a fascist, somewhere you may get tired. Somewhere he's thinking you may relent. You may submit. You may give in. And then it becomes normal to you. Your brain goes to sleep. You've been bombarded by so much information over the last 3.5 years that somehow there's something within you that relents. Well, that's not quite going according to Donald Trump's plan, because there are millions of people all over this country who are in the streets, and they've had enough of the police violence, the fascism, the racism, the killing of black people in this country by police. They've had enough. And they are black, white, Latinx, Asian, Native American, and so many other groups tired of it. They've had enough. And this latest play, beyond the, well, maybe you should inject some bleach into your body, some disinfectant. That didn't go well for his campaign rallies that had to be abandoned after that failure. His next play now is to intimidate Americans, to intimidate you from voting. That's the next ploy, is to intimidate you from voting. He doesn't want you to vote by mail. He wants to get you out into the streets during a pandemic to vote. And then he and his right-wing allies like True the Vote, go do some searches on them. A right-wing group that claims it's interested in making sure there's no chicanery in voting, that there's no voter fraud. They don't make sure that the Republicans stop stealing votes and suppressing them. That's not what they're there for. They're there to check on voter fraud, which doesn't happen in this country. It's a 0.00027 chance of voter fraud. That really happens in this country. There have been less than 30 incidences of it in the last 30 years or so. It is extremely rare. This is all a shell game. This is all about Orwell. So that while they claim, oh, there's all this voter fraud going on, they are actually participating in stealing your vote from you. Christine Engelbrecht, or is it Catherine Engelbrecht, who was the founder of True the Vote, this week was caught on audio, or at least a few months ago, back in April, I should say, was caught on audio recommending that military personnel, the Navy, retired Navy SEALs, in uniform, stand at polls in black neighborhoods and other Democratic-leaning neighborhoods as poll watchers, looking to see if there's going to be any voter fraud. Well, what they're actually doing, and what they would be doing if that were ever to happen, would be engaging in voter intimidation, which is what Republicans do well. They've done it for many decades now. The former Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, William Rehnquist, he's no longer alive, did this before he became a Supreme Court justice. He intimidated poor and black voters. He was 6'3" or 4", and he would come around and aggressively challenge voters, particularly voters who are black or brown, and then force some of them off the voting line and they would not vote. This is all about suppressing the vote, stealing your vote. True the vote is steal the vote. That's what they really should be called. And Donald Trump is getting all kinds of information from them when he says, 3 million people illegally voted. It's all a lie. As a matter of fact, one of their chief spokespeople was committing voter fraud, the very voter fraud they claimed that they were against. The guy was registered to vote in 3 different states at the same time. He only voted once, by the way, in one state. But he was registered to vote in 3 different states at once. If that's not a problem or an illegality, I don't know what is. Donald Trump is collaborating with right-wing people, with Republican groups, with Republican politicians like Mitch McConnell and others in the Republican Party, which really is now a subsidiary, a wholly owned subsidiary of Trump's and of the billionaires in this country like Shelley Adelson and others, who absolutely prop that party up. It's a decaying, dying party that now is really seeking one-party rule and dominance in this country. And quite frankly, they have attained a measure of that. If you look at these state legislatures, even in states where Republicans are losing, the districts are gerrymandered in such a way that they manage to keep power. That's happened in Wisconsin and numerous other states. Meanwhile, you've got the judiciary being filled to the gills with judges who favor, obviously, Donald Trump's point of view. And the same Republicans were the ones who obstructed Obama for 8 years. Obama could not even appoint many judges because Mitch McConnell violated his own constitutional oath and just filibustered or wouldn't allow them to even be considered, many of them. So the judiciary in this country was completely curtailed by Republicans like Mitch McConnell, who, by the way, is up for re-election this November in the Senate. I invite the people of Kentucky to send him packing and vote for Amy McGrath, his Democratic challenger. That is what is going on in this country. And these forces, instead of standing up for what the truth is and standing up for the quote-unquote democracy that we are losing or maybe never had in the first place, they are complicit and enabling, like those 52 Republican senators. And now some of those very senators in the Republican Party are saying, well, I don't know if I can really support Trump this time around. That's Senator Lisa Murkowski yesterday. She was one of the 52 who voted to acquit Donald Trump of abuse of power just 3 months ago today. And 3 months later, it's, well, I don't know if I can support him. I shake my head at Senator Lisa Murkowski. I shake my head at Senator Susan Collins, also a Republican from Maine, someone who is going to be up for re-election. Murkowski is from Alaska. But Susan Collins, her re-election bid is pretty much done. I think that Sarah Gideon, the Democrat, will win that race. And as we get a little bit closer to November, I'll be going much more in depth into some of these key races, not just in the Senate or in the House, but certainly on a more local level, and speak about some of the races that are very important. Senator Collins told us literally 3 months ago that Donald Trump would learn a lesson, that he has learned a lesson from all this. Well, he certainly has not learned a lesson, Senator Collins. But I tell you what, you and 51 of your Republican colleagues have enabled him. And now he continues to destroy the country. And quite frankly, you and your Republican colleagues are complicit in that. There are investigations that are promised. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi is investigating about these unmarked police, which is really terrifying because now you're looking really at private armies. That is fascism. Private armies for Donald Trump in the White House? Private armies? No ID, no badge. Very problematic. The books you must read right now: On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, is by Timothy Snyder. Page 22, Chapter 2, Defend Institutions. And that clip from Michael Moore that I played reflected a naivete among some members of the press, the Jewish press in Germany, saying, oh, well, you know, Hitler's not going to do any of these things because the Constitution says he can't. But what that Jewish newspaper failed to understand was that the institutions can be destroyed and manipulated by the autocrat, by the authoritarian, by the dictator, by the fascist. Institutions cannot defend themselves, and Timothy Snyder talks about that. It is institutions, he writes, that help us to preserve decency. They need our help as well. Do not speak of our institutions unless you make them yours by acting on their behalf. Institutions do not protect themselves. They fall one after the other unless each is defended from the beginning. So choose an institution you care about: a court, a newspaper, a law, a labor union, and take its side. That from Timothy Snyder, his book On Tyranny, which I strongly recommend that you read. There's the book from Sinclair Lewis entitled It Can't Happen Here, published in 1933. Incredible book, by the way. A cautionary tale about the fragility of democracy. It is an alarming, eerily timeless look at how fascism could take hold in America. Written during the Great Depression, when the country was largely oblivious to Hitler's aggression, it juxtaposes sharp political satire with the chillingly realistic rise of a president who becomes a dictator to save the nation from welfare cheats, sex, crime, and the liberal press. Called A Message to Thinking Americans by a Springfield Republican when it was published in 1935, It Can't Happen Here is a shockingly prescient novel that remains as fresh and contemporary as today's news. That's from the back cover of It Can't Happen Here, a book by Sinclair Lewis. Sinclair Lewis, Lewis. I've talked about the book They Thought They Were Free by Milton Mayer. Talked about that several times in the last few episodes. The New York Times has become an enabler again. The New York Times, which you heard in that clip from Michael Moore, that talked about, oh, well, Hitler's being anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic, that it's not as bad as you make it out to be. No, he's just being a clown. He's doing it to get attention. That was the New York Times back in the 1930s, back in 1933. The same year as the Reichstag fire. Now the New York Times this week, literally this week, printed a really disgusting op-ed, a very disturbing op-ed from the Republican senator from Alabama, Tom Cotton. entitled Send in the Troops. Send in the troops. The op-ed proceeded to make these bogus, destructive claims of lawlessness run amok on the streets of this country from peaceful protesters. And what Cotton was saying was, as though the lawlessness has run amok in this country, we need to send in the troops. We need to send in military because the police can't handle this. The police can't handle this? Oh, Senator Cotton, they are handling this quite all right. Thank you very much. They are cracking skulls. Senator Cotton, they are pushing 75-year-old men onto the sidewalk, shoving them down on the sidewalk. Senator Cotton, they are beating women, groping women. Senator Cotton, they are shooting journalists. Senator Cotton, arresting journalists for nothing, beating up Australia news crews. Senator Cotton, the police are handling this quite fine. They are not overmatched. They are fascist and brutal. There is no need for any military to come into the streets of the United States of America and start employing military tactics or doing anything like that. The military of this country is designed to fight abroad, not to fight at home. That is not what this is about. And the New York Times was flagrantly irresponsible in allowing that editorial to even be printed. It is tantamount to Donald Trump's published letter in several newspapers, including the New York Times, back in 1989. Those of you with longer memories will remember that Donald Trump put out a full-page ad in the New York Times and in other national newspapers and a couple of local New York newspapers about the need to bring back the death penalty, bring back our police. This is 1989. Donald Trump has been calling for these kinds of things for decades. I do not think that he is performing, Masha Gessen, with all due respect to you. But I don't think this is performance. I think this is very real. This is from his ad from 31 years ago. Again, it's called Bring Back the Death Penalty, Bring Back Our Police. This was run in New York, and again, it was run nationally in the USA Today and others. This was against 5 innocent Black and Latino boys, Black and Latino boys, who didn't do anything in Central Park. They are the exonerated 5. And here is part of what Donald Trump wrote. He paid $85,000 for this. What has happened to our city over the past 10 years? What has happened to law and order? To the neighborhood cop we all trusted to safeguard our homes and families. The cop who had the power under the law to help us in times of danger. Keep us safe from those who would prey on innocent lives to fulfill some distorted inner need. What has happened to the respect for authority, the fear of retribution by the courts, society, and the police for those who break the law, who wantonly trespass on the rights of others? What has happened is the complete breakdown of life as we knew it. That is the first paragraph of that racist, disgusting ad. And by the way, Tom Cotton's op-ed in the New York Times was essentially a rehash of that very ad, full of lies and alarmism, distortions, hysteria, race baiting. It was disgusting. Donald Trump is a racist. Here's what he said back in 2015. This is not widely reported in the American press at all. This is Donald Trump in October of 2015. This is from an African newspaper. I believe it was the New Zimbabwe. And they were able to publish quotes on things that Donald Trump was saying in Indianapolis in 2015 during his run for the White House. Quote, this is Donald Trump speaking here. Quote, African Americans are very lazy. The best they can do is gallivanting around ghettos, lamenting how they are discriminated. These are the people America doesn't need. They are the enemies of progress. That is Donald Trump from October of 2015. Speaking in Indianapolis, he reiterated a promise to deport Africans. He even said, quote, Africans are lazy, good at sex and theft. How come none of this was reported by the media, by the way? The same media that Donald Trump attacks. And there have been all kinds of attacks on the media since Donald Trump has said all these things about the media being the enemy of the American people, which of course they are not. Donald Trump, as has been discussed by the guest that I played you earlier, has been undermining American institutions. He did it in 2018 in Helsinki. People have already forgotten that. With Vladimir Putin standing right next to him. Oh, the American agencies, I don't know. But I believe Vladimir Putin. I believe him. He believes an enemy of the country over the actual country. So he believes the enemy, Vladimir Putin, over his own country, the United States of America. That's how sick this gets. That happened in Helsinki in June of 2018. There's no telling what will happen between now and January 20th, 2021. But whatever is going to happen, we've got to be ready for it. We've got to plan about voting. iwillvote.com is really one of the places to start. Devise a plan for voting. We are in the middle of a pandemic. We have a movement for human rights and justice that we have to continue to maintain. And we have to be out in the streets. These curfews are unlawful. And why are both Democratic and Republican mayors and governors setting curfews when the looting was relatively small? The media kept focusing on it as if it was the only thing that was happening, and yet did not talk about those police who were starting riots, who were rioting, who were breaking into businesses, who were destroying businesses with hammers. They virtually ignored that. In fact, they did largely ignore it. Why a curfew? Curfews violate people's rights, and curfews can only really be administered when it is absolutely necessary. What should have been done in these American cities, and many of the cities' citizens violated the curfews by deciding to continue to walk. And quite frankly, some of the police departments allowed them to violate the curfew by allowing them to march and continue to demonstrate 2, 3, even 4 hours beyond the curfew deadline. Which goes to show you that these curfews were bogus. And most of them have been lifted now because of challenges to them by groups like Black Lives Matter, by groups like the ACLU, threatening lawsuits against these folks. And that's why they've lifted the curfews, not because of their own good hearts. I maintain that these curfews are illegal, were illegal. And the looting that was going on was not widespread. It was in particular areas in all of these cities and states. And with all these helicopters flying all over the place, and I haven't even got to Obama conducting these war game exercises in Flint, Michigan. That's going to be for another episode at some point. But with all of these bits of technology that the police have, they know darn well where the looting was. So why were governors and mayors instituting curfews? Why were they doing that when the looting was not widespread? The police riots were widespread. The looting was not. It was in particular pockets of each city. And the easiest thing and the easier thing to do would have been to contain those areas and designate them no-go areas and prevent people from entering these parts of town, these particular areas. That would have been the smarter thing to do, and allow protesters to march and just avoid certain areas of the city which were being closed down to contain and stop looting. That's what should have been done. Instead of having entire populations of cities and towns and states be under a curfew, can't go out. None of you can go out because of this looting. That's very dangerous. That is a road to fascism. That is a curtailing of the First Amendment. Those are the things that need to be discussed as well. This curfew should never have happened. Even during 9/11, when we had 9/11 in 2001, what the mayor, I remember, did at the time, Giuliani, was not institute curfews. And we know Giuliani now has become a real freak. And he already was, by the way, even back then. But what Giuliani did back then was close off everything south of 34th Street, I believe it was. Everything south of 34th Street, everything south of Times Square was closed. Nobody could enter Times Square, or rather could not go below Times Square. Between Times Square, or rather from 23rd Street down, from Chelsea, from the 23rd Street area, all the way down to Battery Park City, was all closed off. You couldn't go down there. You could not go down there. That area was all cordoned off. There weren't curfews instituted for the entire city of New York. Not even during 9/11. So why were curfews being instituted in various cities around the country for protesters peacefully protesting? That is authoritarianism. That is a curtailment, a violation of First Amendment right to assembly and freedom of speech. And that is dangerous. I always have felt, well, at least over these last few weeks, that we are being primed to accept and be comfortable with curfews. We have been primed to accept a military state. That's what we are under right now. There must be investigations, and the Democrats are doing that. we must vote this November. Despite the intimidations, despite the pandemic, I know it's sick to say. Look what happened in Wisconsin earlier this year, back in April. Presumably vote by mail will still be available if we fight for the post office, the postal service, to continue on. But if you are one of those who believes in voting in person and does that and wants to do it again, where Donald Trump is concerned, where you can vote him out in person, then be wary of the possibility of voter intimidation by these right-wing thugs and these groups like True the Vote, or as I call them, Steal the Vote, who are going to send Navy SEALs who are retired, who are in uniform and heavily armed to watch you at a polling station while you vote. That's not democracy at all. That's thuggery. Thanks for listening to this edition of The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore.